Good morning to everyone listening to my story. My name is Grace Henderson, but everyone around here in Millfield, Ohio just knows me as Grandma Grace, the lady with the famous apple pies. If you've ever stopped by the farmer's market on Maple Street, you've probably seen me there. A 78-year-old woman with silver hair, always pulled back in a neat bun, wearing one of my colorful hand-knitted cardigans, selling what folks claim are the best apple pies this side of the Mississippi. Today, after holding this story inside for so many years, I've decided it's finally time to share what happened to me. There are some secrets we keep buried for so long that they start to rot us from within, like apples left too long in the cellar, and this particular secret has been suffocating me for decades. I was born in 1945 in a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Millfield. My father, Richard, was a man well respected in our community. He owned the local hardware store, always wore his trademark Stetson hat, and had a habit of chewing on toothpicks while he talked. He was the kind of man who commanded respect with just a glance, But behind closed doors, things were very different. I grew up in a home where my father's word was law. My mother, Helen, bless her heart, lived with her head bowed, always agreeing, always obeying without question. We were 4 children, 3 boys and me, the youngest and only girl. My brothers could do just about anything, go to school, play outside until dark, enjoy a certain kind of freedom. Me, I could barely step beyond our front porch without permission. Proper young ladies don't go wandering about, Father would say in that voice that brooked no argument. A girl needs to learn how to keep house, cook meals, and prepare to be a wife, and so my childhood and youth passed under my father's watchful eye. I only made it through 8th grade before my father decided I'd had enough schooling for a girl. After that, I spent my days helping my mother with housework and learning to cook all the traditional family recipes. I think that's why when I met Jim Reynolds at 17, I fell for him so quickly. He represented an escape from the prison my father's house had become. Jim was 25, worked as a truck driver for a shipping company, and had just moved to our town from Cincinnati. He was handsome, with an easy smile and a way of talking that made you feel like the most important person in the world. We met at a church social. I remember I was helping serve the punch when he came up to the table. He looked right into my eyes and said, "The refreshments must be as sweet as the girl serving them." I blushed bright red, but I felt something stir inside me that day, a flutter in my stomach I'd never experienced before. After that first meeting, Jim started showing up at my father's hardware store regularly, buying things he probably didn't even need just to catch a glimpse of me. My father noticed his intentions pretty quick, but surprisingly didn't object when Jim asked permission to court me. Looking back, I think my father was probably relieved. A married daughter meant one less mouth to feed. Our courtship was short and always supervised. We were never alone together. Either my mother or one of my brothers was always within earshot. Even so, in those brief moments together, Jim painted dreams of a different life for me. He told me about the cities he visited with his truck. He promised that one day he'd take me to see the ocean. "Grace," he'd say, "you deserve more than this small-town life. With me, you'll see the world." And I believed him with all the innocent conviction of my young heart. We got engaged after 6 months of courtship. Jim put a down payment on a small house in the next town over, where we'd live after we were married. He started buying furniture bit by bit, always showing me pictures, including me in the decisions. For the first time in my life, I felt respected, valued as a person with opinions that mattered. The wedding was set for June of 1963. I just turned 18. In the months leading up to it, I barely slept from excitement and nerves. Finally, I would leave my father's house. Finally, I would be in charge of my own life. Finally, I would be able to breathe without that constant feeling of suffocation. Everything seemed perfect, like a dream coming true at last. But what I didn't know was that nightmares mind times begin just when you think you're about to wake up to a better life. And what happened the night before my wedding would change my life forever in ways I could never have imagined. That night, as I lay in bed dreaming about my future with Jim, I had no idea that fate had prepared such a dark twist for me, one that would alter the course of all our lives for generations. What happened that night would be just the beginning of a long road of secrets and pain, but also, eventually, of an incredible strength I never knew I possessed. The evening before the wedding, we had a small celebration at our house. Nothing fancy. We were poor folks, after all. Just a dinner with close family and a few neighbors. Jim couldn't attend because he'd gone to borrow a suit from his cousin in the next county. He was due back the following morning, just in time for the ceremony at the church at 10 o'clock. The house was full that night. My aunts were helping with last-minute preparations, sewing final details on my simple dress, the prettiest one our circumstances could afford. My mother had been cooking since early morning, and the smell of good food filled every room. My brothers were bringing in borrowed chairs, setting up the yard where the meal would be served after the ceremony. In the midst of all this bustling activity, my father was strangely quiet. He sat in his rocking chair on the porch, chewing on his toothpick and watching everything with an expression I couldn't quite read. Every now and then our eyes would meet, and I'd feel an odd chill. There was something different about him, something that left me uneasy without knowing why. When everyone had gone and the house was finally quiet, I went to the small bedroom I shared with my mother. My brothers slept in another room, and my father usually stretched out on a cot on the back porch during hot summer nights. I was arranging the few clothes I would take to my new life when the bedroom door opened. It was Richard. He closed the door behind him and just stood there watching me for what felt like an eternity. "Tomorrow you leave," he finally said, his voice different than usual. "You'll be another man's wife." "Yes, Daddy," I answered softly, finding this conversation strange. My father had never been one for many words, much less for showing affection or concern. He came closer and sat on the edge of the bed where I was folding my clothes. He put his hand on my shoulder in a way that made me freeze. "Do you know what happens between a man and a woman on their wedding night?" he asked, his eyes fixed on mine in a way that made me want to look away, but I couldn't. "Yes, Daddy," I stammered, feeling my face burn. My mother had explained a few things to me, and I'd heard the rest from married women talking by the creek on washing day. "No, you don't," he said, his voice now a husky whisper. "But I'm going to show you." What happened in the next few minutes is something I tried to erase from my memory for decades. His heavy hand covering my mouth so I couldn't scream, his weight crushing me, the physical pain and soul-deep violation of being raped by the man who was supposed to protect me, the silent tears streaming down my face as I prayed to God for it to end quickly. When he finally finished, he stood up, adjusted his clothing as if nothing had happened, and before leaving the room said, "Now you know you won't make a fool of yourself tomorrow." I lay there paralyzed until I heard my mother return. I quickly covered myself, pretended to be asleep. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? My father was respected, a good man in the eyes of our community, and even if they believed me, what would happen to my wedding? Would Jim still want a used woman? I spent the night wide awake, staring into the darkness, my body aching, my soul in pieces. In the morning, I got up mechanically, bathed, dressed, let them fix my hair, looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, empty eyes, forced smile to avoid raising suspicions. I walked down the aisle like a sleepwalker. I saw Jim waiting for me, handsome in his borrowed suit, his eyes shining with happiness. I saw my father beside me, leading me as tradition dictated, the same man who hours before had destroyed something inside me. We said our vows, exchanged rings, received blessings. Throughout the ceremony, I felt my father's gaze on me, the look of someone who knew he had marked his presence permanently in my life even as I moved away. That night in the small bedroom of our new house, when Jim tried to touch me with all the tenderness and respect, I froze. I couldn't explain why. I just cried so much that he got scared, asking what was wrong, if he'd done something to upset me. "I'm just nervous," I lied between sobs. "I need time." Jim, being the good man he was, respected that. We slept holding hands that first night, and for many nights after. It was almost a month before I could let him touch me, and even then I closed my eyes tightly to keep from seeing my father's face superimposed on his. Our married life began that way, with that terrible secret between us, though Jim didn't know it. He traveled a lot, sometimes staying away for weeks with his truck route. I stayed home, trying to build some normalcy, trying to forget. Little by little, I adapted to the role of wife. I learned to smile when he arrived home, respond to his shows of affection, to pretend everything was fine. But inside me, something had broken forever that night before our wedding, an invisible wound that bled silently while I carried on as if nothing had happened. What I didn't know was that this wound would soon manifest in a way I couldn't ignore, and the secret I guarded so carefully would begin to take physical form inside me, growing day by day as living proof of that terrible act. A nightmare hadn't ended that night. It was just beginning to sink its roots deeper into my life. I thought the worst was behind me after that terrible night with my father. Little did I know that life had more pain in store for me. After almost 2 months of marriage, I realized my monthly cycle hadn't come. At first, I thought it was stress, my body reacting to so many changes, but when 3 months passed with no sign, there was no more denying it. I was pregnant. News that should have brought joy brought only panic. I started counting back, remembering dates. Jim and I had only been intimate after almost a month of marriage. Before that, there had only been that night with my father. Desperation consumed me like wildfire through dry hay. The child growing inside me wasn't my husband's, but my own father's. In those days, back in 1963, there weren't those tests they have now to from who a baby's father is. There was no way to prove anything. And even if there were, how would I explain the situation? Who would believe me? How could I tell Jim? All he knew was that we had finally consummated our marriage. And as far as he understood, this baby was the fruit of our love. When I told Jim about the pregnancy, he nearly burst with happiness. He swung me around the living room, made plans, even started building a crib on weekends when he was home. "It's going to be a girl," he said with conviction, strong like her daddy and sweethearted like her mama. Every word of his joy was like a knife in my chest. The guilt ate at me, but the fear was even greater. If I told the truth, I'd lose everything: my marriage, my home, my dignity. At best, Jim would throw me out. At worst, he might kill me in a rage. And who would blame him? In those days, in rural America, washing one's honor in blood was still something many men considered their right. So I did what many women before me have done when cornered by fate. I swallowed my tears and carried on. I pretended everything was fine, that the pregnancy was cause only for celebration. I accepted congratulations from neighbors, advice from older women, gifts from well-wishers. On the outside, the picture of a radiant young wife, on the inside, dying a little each day. My belly grew, and with it, my anguish. On nights when Jim was away on the road, I'd cry myself to sleep, cradling my own belly, asking forgiveness from the innocent creature for all the confusion it would be born into. "It's not your fault, my baby," I'd whisper. "It's not your fault." My mother came to visit when I was 6 months along. She brought some supplies, baby clothes she had sewn, and the inevitable family stories. Among them, she mentioned that my father had been acting strange, quieter than usual, drinking more than was his habit, sometimes disappearing for days. "I think he misses you, Grace," she said innocently. "He was always fond of you, even if he didn't show it." I needed all my self-control not to be sick right there. The mere mention of my father gave me worse nausea than the pregnancy. I quickly changed the subject, asking about my brothers, about news from town, anything to keep him from my thoughts. Before she left, my mother held my hands and said, looking into my eyes, "Your father wants come see his grandchild when it's born. He never says so, but I know he's proud." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. "No, Mom," I replied firmly, perhaps too firmly. "I'd rather wait till the baby's a bit older. A newborn is too fragile for such a long trip." It was a weak excuse, but the only one I could come up with in that moment. The truth was, the idea of my father near my child, his child, filled me with indescribable terror. I would not allow him near the baby, even if I had to run to the ends of the earth. Linda was born on a rainy dawn in March of 1964. It was a difficult, long labor, 20 hours of pain that seemed endless. Jim was on the road. He couldn't get back in time. It was our neighbor, Mrs. Martha, an experienced midwife, who helped bring that little one into the world. When I finally heard the cry and Martha placed the baby in my arms, all bloody and perfect, something strange happened inside me. I had expected to feel rejection, even disgust for this child who carried the blood of my tormentor. But what I felt was love so overwhelming, so all-encompassing, it barely fit in my chest. I looked at that red, wrinkled face and saw only my daughter. Not my father's daughter, not proof of my torment, just my daughter, blood of my blood. "She's a beautiful, strong little girl," said Martha, wiping sweat from my forehead. "What are you going to call her?" "Linda," I answered without hesitation. It was my grandmother's name, the only person who had shown me true affection in my childhood. Linda meant beautiful, and I prayed that my daughter would have the beauty to overcome the weight of the blood she carried, though she would never know it. Jim arrived 2 days later, exhausted from the journey he had cut short upon hearing of the birth. He entered the room where I was nursing Linda. With eyes wide with emotion, he approached slowly, as if afraid to break the scene, and looked at his daughter with such love that my heart tightened with guilt. "She's perfect," he whispered, touching Linda's tiny hand with his finger. "Just like you, Grace." I thanked God in that moment that Linda didn't resemble my father at all. She had my features, my eyes, my nose. Nothing in her betrayed her true origin. It was a small miracle amid the nightmare I was living. The first months with Linda were a period of adjustment. Jim managed to reduce his travel time, staying home more to help me. He was a dedicated father, changing diapers without complaint, getting up at dawn when the baby cried, singing lullabies with his off-key voice full of love. Watching that scene, I often found myself thinking that, despite everything, Linda was lucky. She might never know her biological father, and that was a blessing. But she had a real father, a man who loved her unconditionally. During those first months, I could pretend everything was fine. I could pretend we were a normal, happy family building a life together, but in the depths of my heart, I knew it was only a matter of time before the past would knock on our door again. And when it did, I wasn't sure I would have the strength to face it. What I didn't know then was how soon that moment would arrive, and how devastating it would be for all of us when the truth began to emerge like a monster that could no longer be kept underwater. When Linda turned 6 months old, I received the visit I had been dreading. My father showed up unannounced one Tuesday afternoon. Jim was at work, and I was alone at home with the baby. I opened the door, and there he stood, the same Stetson hat, the same toothpick in the corner of his mouth, but with more wrinkles and gray hair than I remembered. "Came to meet my granddaughter," he said simply, as if he had every right to be there. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to invite him in, unable to send him away. Linda was in her makeshift crib in the living room, sleeping peacefully. Her cry at that exact moment was like a divine signal, an excuse to get away from him. "She's awake," I mumbled, turning my back to attend to my daughter. I picked Linda up in my arms, holding her tight against my chest, as if I could protect her by the sheer force of my embrace. When I turned around, my father had already entered and closed the door behind him. He stood in the middle of the living room, watching me with Linda in my arms. "Let me see her," he asked, taking a step in my direction. "No," I responded instinctively, backing away. The word came out before I could think, strong and definitive. He frowned, surprised by my refusal. In all my life, I had never said no to him. "What's wrong, Grace? Why are you acting like this?" "I just want to see my granddaughter." "She's not your granddaughter," I replied, my voice trembling but determined. "She's nothing to you." In that moment, I saw understanding cross his face like lightning. He realized what I meant. He understood that I knew Linda was his daughter, not his granddaughter. His face hardened. His eyes turned colder than I'd ever seen them. "Watch what you say, girl," he threatened in a low voice. "Some things are best left buried." "Leave," I demanded, feeling my legs weakening but standing firm. "Leave and never come back. I don't want you near my daughter ever again." He stared at me for a long moment, as if assessing whether it was worth insisting. Finally, he put his Stetson back on his head and headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time. "You owe obedience to your father, Grace, always. Don't forget that." After he left, I collapsed onto the floor, still clutching Linda, and cried like I had never cried before. I cried from fear, from anger, from momentary relief. I knew he wouldn't give up so easily. Men like my father don't take no from a woman, much less from a daughter. When Jim came home that night, he immediately noticed something was wrong. I was pale, restless, constantly looking out the window. "What's going on, Grace?" he asked, concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost told him everything then. I almost opened my heart and spilled all that poison that was corroding me from within. But fear won out. Fear of losing Jim, fear of losing Linda, fear of destroying the family we were building. "It's nothing," I lied. "I'm just tired." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me start, imagining my father breaking into our house. For days afterward, I lived in a constant state of alert. I never left Linda alone, not even for a minute. I took her with me even to hang laundry in the yard. Jim noticed my strange behavior, but attributed it to the exhaustion of caring for a small baby. "You need to rest more," he would always say. "Let me take Linda when I'm home." And so the months passed. Linda grew strong and healthy, oblivious to her mother's torment. She started crawling, then taking her first steps, babbling her first words. Dada was one of the first, and how it both hurt and comforted me to hear her call Jim that. It hurt because it was a constant reminder of the lie I was living. It comforted because, in reality, he was the only father she knew. And if God willed it, the only one she would ever know. But fate had other plans for us. And my father, despite my rejection, was not willing to disappear from our lives so easily. What I didn't know was that he was weaving an invisible net around us, patiently waiting for the right moment to trap not only me, but my innocent daughter too. A web that would entangle us all in a tangle of lies, secrets, and betrayals that would take decades to fully unravel. When Linda turned a year old, I received a letter from my mother. Among routine news and questions about her granddaughter was a paragraph that chilled me to the bone. "Your father is determined to visit you next month. Says he's waited long enough to properly meet his granddaughter. We're saving up for the bus ticket." Panic took hold of me. I couldn't let him come, couldn't let him be under the same roof as Linda, couldn't let him try to establish any kind of bond with her. But how to prevent it without raising suspicions? How to explain to Jim, to my mother, to everyone that I didn't want my own father near? It was then that I made a drastic decision. We needed to move far away, somewhere my father couldn't easily find us. I knew it would be difficult to convince Jim. He had a good job as a driver. He knew the routes in the region. We had just settled into that house. But I was determined. That night, when he came home from work, I presented the idea as if it were a long-held dream. "Jim, I've been thinking, what if we moved to Chicago? The big city has more opportunities. You could get a better job, earn more. Linda could go to better schools when she's older." He looked at me, surprised. "Chicago is so far away, Grace, and we don't know anyone there." "That's exactly why," I insisted. "It would be a fresh start. You always talked about showing me the world. Remember? Chicago would just be the beginning." I argued for days. I used every tactic I knew. I talked about opportunities, better salaries, Linda's future. I never mentioned my father, never mentioned the fear, never gave any hint of the real reason behind this sudden desire for change. Finally, after much insistence, Jim agreed. "All right," he said, giving in. "We'll try it. If it doesn't work out, we can always come back." I wrote to my mother the next day, informing her of the sudden move. I said Jim had been offered an irrefusable job in Chicago, and we needed to relocate immediately. I asked her to let my father know that, unfortunately, the visit would have to be postponed indefinitely. We sold what little we had. We pooled our savings, and in less than a month we were on a bus headed for Chicago. Linda, now just over a year old, slept in my lap, unaware of the desperate flight we were undertaking. Jim, beside me, seemed excited about the new adventure. I alternated between relief at escaping and fear that somehow my father would discover our whereabouts. The first months in Chicago were difficult. The city, big, noisy, and chaotic, was a brutal contrast to the quiet rural life we knew. We rented a tiny room in a boarding house in the South Side, where we shared a bathroom and kitchen with 5 other families. Jim got a job as a helper in an auto repair shop. He earned less than as a driver, but at least he was close to home. I started baking apple pies to sell at the door of the boarding house. I had learned from my grandmother, and soon my pies became famous in the neighborhood. We didn't earn much, but it was enough to survive and save a little each month, dreaming of a better place to raise Linda. Life continued like this for almost 2 years. Linda grew beautiful and smart, talking nonstop, running through the boarding house hallways, making friends with all the children. Jim, with a lot of effort, managed to be promoted to mechanic at the shop, which improved our financial situation a bit. I continued with my pies, which I now sold at a makeshift stand in a nearby market. It was in that market that the past caught up with me. I was focused on preparing a batch of pies when I heard a voice that froze me to the spot. "Can't believe I found you, daughter." I looked up and there was Richard, my father, older, more worn, but with the same look that haunted me in nightmares. He had found me. How did you find me?" I asked, my voice almost disappearing. "Wasn't easy," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But a father always finds his daughter, no matter where she hides." I later discovered he had followed clues, letters from my mother that vaguely mentioned where we were, conversations with acquaintances who had relatives in Chicago. A methodical, patient search that lasted almost 2 years, and now he was there in front of me, like a nightmare materializing in broad daylight. "What do you want?" I asked, looking around to make sure Linda wasn't nearby. She usually stayed with a neighbor when I worked at the market, but sometimes she came to visit me. "To see my granddaughter," he replied simply, as if it were the most natural request in the world. Or should I say, my daughter? The blood froze in my veins. It was the first time he had openly admitted it, confirming what I already knew but was still desperately trying to deny to myself. "Leave," I whispered angrily. "You have nothing here that's yours." "Oh, but I do," he insisted, his voice low but threatening. "And if you don't let me see her the easy way, I'll tell your husband everything. How do you think he'll react to knowing he's been raising my daughter as if she were his own?" It was the threat I feared most, my worst nightmare taking form in his words. I was left without reaction, paralyzed between fear and anger. "I'm staying at the Jefferson Hotel near the church," he continued, as if we were discussing a simple family meeting. "I'll be there for a week. I expect your visit with the little one. If you don't show up by Thursday, I'll look for your husband at the shop." And with that he turned and left, leaving me trembling so much I had to lean on the stand to keep from falling. I spent the next days in agony. I couldn't give in to the blackmail. Allowing him near Linda was unthinkable, but I also couldn't risk Jim discovering the truth in such a brutal way. What to do, where to run this time? It was that night, as I debated between impossible options, that Jim came home earlier than usual. He was pale, his hands trembling. He sat at the table in our small kitchen and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "A man came looking for me at the shop today," he said, his voice controlled but tense. "Said he was your father." My world collapsed in that instant. He hadn't waited until Thursday. He hadn't even given me that chance. What did he want? I asked, knowing the answer but trying to buy time, trying to think of some way out. He wanted to talk about Linda, Jim replied, still staring at me fixedly. About how she's not my daughter. The floor disappeared beneath my feet in that moment. The secret I had guarded for so long, the truth I had buried in the depths of my soul, was now exposed like an open wound. I looked at Jim and saw in his eyes a mixture of confusion, anger, and pain that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. "What exactly did he tell you?" I managed to ask, my voice almost disappearing. Jim ran his hand over his face, suddenly looking much older than his 30 years. "He told me that Linda isn't my daughter, that when we got married, you were already pregnant by another man, that you've been lying to me all this time." He hit the table hard, making the plate that was there jump. "Is it true, Grace? Tell me it's not true." At that moment, I could have made up any story. I could have said my father was crazy, he was trying to separate us for some dark reason, that it was all lies. But looking at the man who had been my safe harbor all those years, who had loved Linda as his own daughter, who had given me a life I never dreamed I could have, I couldn't continue the lie. "It's true," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Linda isn't your biological daughter, but you are the only father she knows, the only father she loves." His face contorted in an expression of pain so deep that I felt as if I had stabbed him in the chest. He rose abruptly, the chair falling to the floor with the movement. "How could you?" he shouted, forgetting for a moment that Linda was asleep in the room next door. "How could you lie to me all these years, make me believe that little girl was mine? Make me love her?" His voice failed. For all the anger he felt toward me in that moment, the love for Linda was real. It couldn't be undone by a revelation, no matter how painful. "Who's the father?" he asked after a long silence, his voice now lower, contained. "Is it someone from our town? Someone I know?" That was the question I feared most. The question I couldn't answer without completely destroying our family, without forever tainting Linda's image. How to tell him that our little girl's father was also my father? How to explain the horror that had occurred on the eve of our wedding? "It doesn't matter who it is," I replied, trying to buy time. "It was just once before we were married. A terrible mistake that never happened again. Please, Jim, you have to believe me." "Doesn't matter?" he laughed without humor. "Of course it matters. I spent 3 years thinking I had a daughter, and now I discover I've been raising another man's child. I have a right to know who he is." At that moment, Linda began to cry in the bedroom, awakened by the shouting. Instinctively, I stood up to go to her, but Jim held me by the arm. "Don't run from this conversation," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "Who is Linda's father?" Linda's crying increased, now calling Mama, Dada, in that little voice that always melted our hearts. I saw Jim's face change when he heard that call. For an instant, all the anger gave way to a profound sadness. "Go," he finally said, releasing my arm. "Go comfort her, but this conversation isn't over." I ran to the room. I took Linda in my arms, cradling her and whispering words of comfort while my own tears wet her hair. The little one soon calmed down, falling back asleep in my arms, unaware of the hurricane devastating our family that night. When I returned to the kitchen, Jim was gone. He had left without saying where he was going, without saying if he would return. I spent the night awake, cradling Linda, looking out the window at every sound of footsteps in the street, praying he would come back, give me a chance to explain, though I didn't know how to explain something inexplicable. He returned the next morning, his red eyes betraying a sleepless night, smelling of whiskey. He was calmer, but he sat on the edge of the bed where I was with Linda and stared at her for a long time, as if searching in her features for some sign of the truth that had been hidden from him. "I need to know, Grace," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I need to know who the father is." "Why, Jim?" I asked, desperately. "What difference will it make? You are her father in every way that matters. She loves you as a father. You love her as a daughter. Why do we need to bring that person into our lives?" "Because I need to understand. I need to know why you did this to me. If it was someone you loved. If it was—" He stopped suddenly, a new suspicion arising in his eyes. "Was it by force? Did someone force you?" The question hung in the air, heavy as lead. It was the first time anyone had put into words what had happened. Even without knowing exactly, I felt as if a dam inside me had broken, and before I could control it, the words began to pour out between sobs. "Yes," I confessed, hugging Linda tighter, as if I could protect her from the terrible truth. "Yes, it was by force. On the eve of our wedding." I saw Jim's face change, anger giving way to shock, then understanding, and finally to a compassion I hadn't expected to see so soon. "Who?" he asked, his voice now a tense whisper. "Who did that to you, Grace?" I lowered my eyes, unable to look at him, as I said those words. "My father," I whispered, so low he had to lean in to hear. "It was my father." The silence that followed was the longest and heaviest of my life. When I finally had the courage to look at Jim, I saw on his face an expression I'll never forget. A mixture of horror, disgust, and a rage so great it frightened me. "Your father?" he repeated, as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. "Your own father did that to you? And then he came here to see Linda?" I nodded, unable to speak more. The whole story I had kept buried for 3 years came out little by little. The night before the wedding, the fear that prevented me from telling the truth, the discovery of the pregnancy, my father's visit, the flight to Chicago, and now, finally, him finding us. Jim listened to everything in silence, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. When I finished, he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street below. "Where is he now?" he asked after a long silence. "At the Jefferson Hotel near the church," I answered, feeling a chill as I recalled my father's words. "But Jim, please don't do anything. He could hurt you. He could hurt us even more." Jim turned to me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw tears in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me before, Grace? Why did you carry this burden alone? I would have understood. I would have helped you. We could have faced this together." "I was afraid," I confessed, the tears returning with force. "Afraid you wouldn't believe me. Afraid that even if you did believe me, you wouldn't want to marry me anymore, that you wouldn't consider me clean enough. Afraid of losing the only chance at happiness I'd ever had in my life." He came closer, sat beside me on the bed, and to my surprise, embraced me. A strong, protective embrace that said more than any words could. "I love you, Grace," he said, his voice breaking. "I've loved you since the first day I saw you at that church social. Nothing your father did changes that." He looked at Linda, who was sleeping peacefully between us. "And Linda is my daughter. No matter how she came into this world, she is my daughter right here." And he pointed to his heart. In that moment, for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could truly breathe. The weight of the secret had been lifted, and even in the midst of the storm we were still facing, there was a glimmer of hope. "What are we going to do now?" I asked uncertainly. "First, I'm going to make sure your father never comes near you two again," Jim replied, an iron determination in his voice. "Then, we're going to start over, maybe somewhere else where nobody knows us, where Linda can grow up without this shadow." "But what are you going to do about my father? He's dangerous, Jim. I don't want you to get hurt because of us." "I'm not going to get hurt, and I'm not going to do anything stupid. But he needs to understand that he will never come near my family again." What Jim would do next would change the course of our lives forever, but in a way none of us could imagine at that moment. Fate, which had played against us so many times, was about to give us a unique opportunity for redemption and perhaps even justice. Though, as we would discover, sometimes justice comes in the most unexpected forms. Jim left shortly after. He said he was going to talk to my father to make things clear. I stayed at home trembling with fear, imagining 1,000 terrible scenarios. What if my father hurt Jim? What if he called the police, made up some story? What if Jim lost control and did something that would land him in jail? The hours dragged by like days. Linda woke up, played, ate happily, unaware of the drama unfolding, looking at her so innocent, so full of life. I wondered how something so pure could have come from such a terrible act. She was a daily reminder that even in the darkest situations, life finds a way to bloom. Jim returned late in the afternoon. He looked exhausted, but strangely at peace. There were no signs of a fight or of drinking. He sat next to me on the bed and held my hands. "It's done," he said simply. "He won't bother you anymore." "What did you do?" I asked, fearful of the answer. "I talked to him, made it clear that I know everything, that Linda is my daughter in the eyes of the law and of God, and that if he tries to come near you again, I'll go to the police and tell everything. I know it might be hard to prove after so much time, but the scandal would be enough to destroy his reputation in that small town. That's what men like him fear most, losing their mask of respectability." "And he just accepted it, just like that?" Jim gave a sad smile. "It wasn't easy. He denied everything at first. Then he tried to threaten me, then tried to bribe me. But when he saw that none of that worked, that I wasn't afraid of him, he finally gave in, said he'll leave first thing tomorrow morning and will never look for you again." I wanted to believe it. I desperately wanted to believe it would be that simple, but I knew my father too well to think he would give up so easily. "I don't trust him, Jim. He might be saying that just to buy time to plan something." "I don't trust him either," he admitted. "That's why I think it's better if we move again, farther away. This time I was thinking about Detroit. I have a cousin there who can help us find work, a place to stay." "Detroit?" I repeated, scared at the idea of a city so big, so far from everything I knew. "Are you sure?" "It's far enough that he won't find us easily, and big enough for us to get lost in the crowd. We can start over there, Grace. A new life without these shadows from the past." The idea was terrifying but also liberating. Leaving everything behind, not just the old furniture and cracked pots, but mainly the ghosts that haunted us. Having a real chance at happiness, at raising Linda without fear, at living the love we felt for each other without that dark cloud hovering over us. "Let's go." I finally agreed. "Let's go to Detroit." The following weeks were a flurry of frantic preparations. We sold what little we had. We scraped together every penny. Jim quit the auto shop. I wrote one last letter to my mother, saying only that we were moving again, without mentioning where, asking her not to try to find us. It was painful to cut these last ties, but necessary for our safety. We left on a sunny August morning in 1967. Linda, now 3.5 years old, was excited about the idea of traveling on a bus too young to understand the real reasons for the change. She experienced it all as a great adventure. The journey was long and exhausting. 3 days on the road, sleeping in cheap motels along the way, eating what we could at rest stops. Linda, always adaptable, turned each stop into a new game. Jim, despite the fatigue, maintained that determined look of a man fighting for his family's future. I alternated between hope for a new life and fear that somehow the past would catch up with us again. We arrived in Detroit on a hot afternoon. The city was a shock to our eyes, accustomed to smaller places. The enormous buildings, congested streets, the constant movement of people, cars, buses. Jim's cousin, Stephen, was waiting for us at the bus station. He had found a small room for us in a boarding house in the South Side and a helper position for Jim in the garage where he worked. "It's not much," Stephen said as he took us to our new home, "but it's a start." The little room was tiny. It barely fit a double bed and a mattress on the floor for Linda. The bathroom was shared with 3 other families, as was the improvised kitchen in the hallway. But it was ours. It was safe. It was a new beginning. Jim started working the next day. After a few days exploring the surroundings, I realized I couldn't sell pies like before. Midwest cooking wasn't as popular, and there were already many street food vendors in the area. I needed to adapt. I learned from a neighbor, Martha, to make Detroit-style coney dogs and square deep dish pizza, foods that locals loved. Soon I set up a small stand in the neighborhood market, selling these dishes which, to my surprise, were as successful as my pies had been in Chicago. Linda came with me, helping in the way a 4-year-old could help, smiling at customers, telling made-up stories, charming everyone with her vivacious personality. The months went by, and slowly we put down roots in that big, chaotic city. Jim was promoted at the garage, earning enough for us to rent a slightly better place, a tiny apartment, but all our own, without shared bathrooms. Linda started attending a little public school near our home, where she soon stood out for her intelligence and ease at making friends. I continued with my food stand, which gradually grew, gaining fame in the neighborhood. For the first time in our lives, we had some financial security, some stability. The ghost of my father slowly receded. I stopped looking over my shoulder at every corner. I stopped waking up startled in the middle of the night, thinking I'd heard his voice. Distance and time built a barrier that, though fragile, protected us from those memories. Jim and I were also rebuilding our relationship. The trauma of the revelation about Linda had left scars, of course, but he kept his word. He never treated Linda differently for knowing the truth about her origin. On the contrary, he seemed even more determined to be the best father possible, as if he wanted to compensate her for something she didn't even know she had lost. Our intimate life, which had been difficult from the beginning due to the trauma I carried, slowly began to oomo. Jim was patient, respectful, never pressured me. With time, I learned to separate that terrible night from the expressions of love between the 2 of us. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of relapse, nights when an innocent touch triggered memories that paralyzed me. but he always understood, always waited, always loved me. Despite everything, when Linda turned 5 years old, in 1969, I discovered I was pregnant again. It was a surprise. After so long trying without success, we had almost given up on the idea of having more children. The doctor at the health center said that probably the stress and trauma had affected my fertility, and now that we were more at peace, my body was finally ready. The news brought a joy we hadn't expected to feel again. Linda was excited about the idea of a little brother or sister. Jim, though worried about finances, was beside himself with happiness. And I felt as if the universe was giving me a second chance, a planned pregnancy, wanted, the fruit of true love. In the months that followed, our little family experienced a peace we had never known before. Jim worked hard. I maintained my stand even with my growing belly. Linda was doing well in school and talked nonstop about the baby that was coming. It was as if we had finally left behind that dark shadow that haunted us. Until in the 7th month of pregnancy, we received a letter that changed everything again. That letter, with its unexpected and disturbing message, would remind us that the past is never completely buried, and sometimes, when we think we've escaped our demons, they find new and terrible ways to return to our lives, affecting not only us but also those we love most, our children. The letter was from my mother, the first in almost 2 years since we had moved to Detroit. I don't know how she got our address. I suspected that Stephen, Jim's cousin, might have given some clue, even without knowing the whole story. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. The shaky handwriting of my mother, who barely knew how to write, brought news I never expected to receive. My daughter Grace, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been looking for you for a long time. Your father passed away 2 months ago. He had a stroke while working in the field. He didn't suffer. It was quick. Before he died, he told me everything about what he did to you on the eve of your wedding, about Linda. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me for not protecting you. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself. I just know I need to see you, meet my granddaughter, ask for your forgiveness in person. If you can find room in your heart for your mother, please write back to me. I'm living with your brother Stephen now. With love and regret, your mother, Helen. I read the letter several times, tears blurring my vision. My father was dead. The monster of my nightmares no longer existed. And my mother now knew the truth, a truth she would have to carry for the rest of her life, just as I did. When Jim got home from work, I showed him the letter. He read it in silence. Then he embraced me for a long time. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked. It was a difficult question. Part of me wanted to ignore the letter, move on as if that chapter of my life was definitively closed. But another part, the part that was still a daughter, that still remembered the few moments of affection my mother managed to show amid my father's oppression, wanted to respond. I wanted to give her the chance to meet Linda, to meet the new baby that was coming. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "I need to think about it." That night, I couldn't sleep. Lying next to Jim, I felt the baby moving in my belly as if it too was uneasy about the news. Linda slept peacefully in the small room next door, unaware of the whirlwind of emotions her mother was facing. I thought about my mother, about that silent, submissive woman who never had a voice in her own home. Had she suspected something? Had she noticed any change in my father's behavior or in mine after that night? Or had the deathbed revelation been a complete shock, a final betrayal from a man who had already betrayed her in so many ways. I thought about Linda, who had never known a grandmother. My mother-in-law had died even before Jim and I met, and now my mother was there, wanting to be part of her life. Did I have the right to deny Linda that, to deny her the chance to have one more piece of family, especially now that the real danger, my father, no longer existed? And finally, I thought about the baby I was carrying. This son or daughter would be born into a world where their maternal grandfather no longer existed, where the terrible secret that surrounded their sister's birth no longer had the same power to destroy our family. Wouldn't it be better if they were also born into a world where there was reconciliation, forgiveness, healing? After days of reflection, with Jim's support, I made my decision. I wrote back to my mother inviting her to visit us after the baby was born. I didn't promise forgiveness, nor did I know if I was capable of that yet, but I offered an opening, a chance to rebuild some kind of relationship. David was born on a December dawn in 1969, strong and healthy like his father. Linda, now almost 6 years old, was delighted with her little brother, immediately assuming the role of protective big sister. Jim, who was already a wonderful father to Linda, melted with the son who carried his blood, though never, not for an instant, did he make any distinction between the two children. My mother arrived 2 weeks later. She was older, thinner, her eyes carrying a weight I recognized well, the weight of guilt, of belated regret. Our reunion was difficult, filled with contained tears, choked words, feelings too complex to be expressed. Linda, with the innocence of children, broke the ice. She approached the grandmother she had never known and simply asked, "Do you know how to tell stories? Daddy tells stories every night, but he always forgets the funniest parts." My mother smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen on her face in years. "I know many stories, my little one, stories from the countryside, about animals, about ghosts." "Ghosts!" exclaimed Linda excitedly. "Tell one now." And so, around stories, first for Linda, then for all of us, my mother slowly reconnected with our family. It wasn't easy or quick. There were wounds too deep, silences too long between us. But day by day, visit after visit, she ended up moving to Detroit to a small room not far from ours. We rebuilt something resembling a mother-daughter relationship. We never spoke directly about what my father had done. It was a topic that floated between us, omnipresent but never mentioned. Perhaps it was better that way. Some truths are too heavy to be put into words, even between people who share the pain. The years went by. Linda grew up, became a bright teenager, determined to study, to be somebody in life. David followed in his father's footsteps, passionate about cars from a young age. Helping in the garage Jim finally managed to open after years of saving. Our life wasn't perfect. We had financial difficulties, health problems, arguments like any family, but we had something that for a long time I thought I would never have: peace. The peace of living without fear, without suffocating secrets, without the constant shadow of a past that threatened to destroy everything at any moment. Linda never knew the truth about her origin. It was a conscious decision that Jim and I made together. What good would it do her to know? What purpose would it serve beyond burdening her with a weight that wasn't even hers to carry? Jim was her father in all the ways that mattered, in love, in dedication, in constant presence. The biological truth was merely a dark detail that didn't need to enter her life. My mother, who initially thought that Linda had a right to know, eventually agreed with our decision. She's a happy girl, she said once, watching Linda play with David in the small yard of the ground floor apartment we had moved to. Your father has already done too much harm to this family. He doesn't need to continue doing it after his death. And so we continued building a life that, if not extraordinary in the eyes of the world, was precious to us. A life built on the ruins of a terrible past, but one that flourished despite everything, or perhaps in some strange way because of everything we had been through. The years passed like water in a river, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always moving forward. Linda grew up and became a beautiful, studious, determined young woman. With much sacrifice on our part, she managed to enter nursing school She was the first person in the family to set foot in a university, and the pride we felt couldn't fit in our chests. David, our little one, followed in his father's footsteps and became a skilled mechanic. By 18, he was already Jim's right hand in the garage, which had now grown and employed 3 more people. Our life had found a balance I never thought would be possible after everything I went through. We had our own home, small but comfortable, in a modest neighborhood in South Detroit. My food stand had evolved into a small traditional restaurant, Midwestern comfort, which was successful in the neighborhood. My mother, now elderly but still lucid, lived with us since a heart problem prevented her from living alone. It was a good life, a life that made me thank God every day for giving me the strength to survive and build something beautiful from the ashes. The secret about Linda's origin remained buried, known only by me, Jim, and my mother. It was a weight we carried so that Linda could live free from it. Or so we thought. It was on a September night in 1991 when our carefully constructed world began to crumble. Linda, then 25 years old, had finished university and was working as a nurse in a public hospital. She was engaged to Jason Wright, a doctor she met during her internship. He was a good young man from a simple family like ours, who treated her with respect and affection. The wedding was set for December of that year. We were all in the living room after Sunday dinner, a tradition we religiously maintained. Jim and David were discussing football. My mother was dozing in the armchair. I was adjusting some details on the wedding dress we were making to save money. Linda was quiet, playing with her engagement ring, with a distant look that didn't match her usually vivacious personality. "Everything okay, honey?" I asked, noticing her uneasiness. She raised her eyes to me, and what I saw in them frightened me. A mixture of fear, confusion, and determination that immediately reminded me of myself decades ago when I was facing my own demons. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice firmer than her look suggested. "To all of you." Something in the way she spoke made the whole room fall silent. Even my mother woke from her nap, sitting up straighter in the armchair. Jim turned off the television. David stopped leafing through the car magazine. All eyes turned to Linda, who now seemed to be gathering courage to say something difficult. "I'm pregnant," she finally announced. There was a moment of bewilderment followed by exclamations of joy. A baby, news that would normally be celebrated with hugs and congratulations. But something in Linda's face said there was more, much more. "That's wonderful, honey," I exclaimed, trying to hide my apprehension. "You two are starting a family a little earlier than planned, but that's no problem. The wedding is already close, and—" "It's not that, Mom," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "The problem isn't being pregnant before the wedding. The problem is—" She took a deep breath, like someone gathering courage for a jump into deep water. "The problem is that the baby isn't Jason's." The room fell into a sepulchral silence. Jim straightened in his chair, his face suddenly serious. David looked uncomfortable, as if witnessing something he shouldn't. My mother put her hand to her chest, a gesture that had become common since her heart problems. "What do you mean?" "It's not Jason's," I asked, trying to keep calm. "Linda, what's going on?" She began to cry, tears silently running down the face that so resembled mine. "I don't know how to tell this. It's so horrible, so impossible." At that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something too familiar in that scene, in those words, in that contained desperation. Without realizing it, I brought my hand to my mouth, fearing what would come next. "It was my grandfather," she said finally, the words coming out as if they were being torn from her throat. "The father of my baby is my grandfather." The room spun around me. I looked at Jim, who had turned deathly pale. "What?" David jumped to his feet, fists clenched. "What are you saying? Your grandfather has been dead for years." "No," replied Linda, her voice now strangely calm amid the chaos. "He's not dead. He's alive, and he lives in Columbus." Time seemed to freeze. I felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath my feet, as if I was fall into an endless abyss. How was this possible? How could Richard be alive? "What are you talking about, Linda?" asked David, completely confused. "Your grandfather died before you were born." Linda shook her head, drying her tears with the back of her hand. "No, that's what my parents and grandmother made me believe. But I discovered the truth a few months ago." She looked at my mother, who seemed about to faint. "Isn't that right, Grandma?" I looked at my mother, who was now crying silently, her face buried in her hands, and I knew in that instant that I had been deceived, that my father's death had been a merciful lie told by my mother to give me peace, to protect us. "Mom," I called, my voice trembling with contained emotion. "Is it true? Is he alive?" She raised her face, red eyes, trembling hands. "Forgive me, my daughter," she whispered. "I thought it would be better that way. He had disappeared. No one knew where he was. When I came to Detroit, I thought you would be safer if you believed he was dead." The betrayal hit me like a punch to the stomach. So many years living with that lie, believing the monster of my nightmares could no longer reach me, when in reality he was out there, alive, and now he had found Linda. "What did he do to you?" I asked Linda, fearing the answer but needing to know. "Did he hurt you?" Linda lowered her eyes, unable to look at me. "It wasn't like that at first," she said in a low voice. "He introduced himself as a distant relative who had known me when I was a baby. He was nice, told family stories, bought me gifts, said he had information about my past but needed time to tell me everything." My stomach turned. I knew that tactic well, the calculated kindness, the subtle manipulation, the building of trust for later. "We met several times," continued Linda. "He always had a new story, a new detail, but he never told me the whole truth, until one day, after a few drinks." She stopped, unable to continue. She didn't need to. I knew exactly what had happened. The same horror I had experienced decades ago, repeating itself with my daughter in a perverse cycle that seemed endless. "Only afterward," Linda resumed, her voice now almost a whisper, "only afterward did he tell me he was my grandfather and that he had an important story to tell me about my origin." "What did he tell you?" I asked, feeling a knot in my throat. "He told me that you and he—" The words seemed to get stuck in her mouth. "He told me that I was his daughter, not just his granddaughter, that you and he had had a secret relationship before you married Dad. The final lie, the supreme manipulation. Not only had he abused her, but he had distorted the truth to appear less monstrous, to make Linda believe it had been an affair, not a rape. And now she was carrying his child, just as I had carried her. Jim, who had remained silent, absorbing everything with growing horror, finally spoke. His voice was different, deeper, harder than I had ever heard it. "Where is he now?" "In a hotel downtown," replied Linda. "He followed me to Detroit. He says he wants to be part of the baby's life." "No," said Jim, the word coming out like a growl. "That will never happen." Linda began to cry again, her body shaking with sobs. "I don't know what to do. Jason doesn't know anything about this. How am I going to tell him? How can I explain that the baby I'm expecting is my own?" She couldn't finish the sentence. David, who had remained in shock until that moment, approached his sister and hugged her awkwardly, not fully understanding what was happening, but feeling her pain. "Linda," I called, forcing myself to remain calm despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "My daughter, look at me." She raised her eyes, red from crying. "There's something you need to know," I continued, feeling that it was time, finally, to tell the whole truth. "Something about your birth, about your origin." And then for the first time I told the complete story. The rape on the eve of my wedding, the discovery of the pregnancy, the decision to raise Linda as Jim's daughter, the persecution by Richard, the flight to Chicago and then to Detroit, the lie about his death. I told everything without sparing details, while tears ran down my face and everyone else's in the room. When I finished, the silence that followed was dense, almost palpable. Linda looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Horror, understanding, perhaps even some relief for finally understanding her own story. "So, I am," she began, her voice failing. "You are my daughter," I interrupted firmly, "and Jim's daughter who raised you with all the love in the world. Your origin doesn't define who you are, Linda. It never has." "And the baby?" she asked, putting her hand on her still flat stomach. "What do I do with this baby?" The question hung in the air, heavy as lead. It was an impossible decision, a terrible crossroads in my daughter's life, and ironically, one I never had to face. When I discovered I was expecting Linda, abortion wasn't an option I even considered, both because of my beliefs and because of the complete lack of access to such a thing in rural America of the early 60s. But we were in 1991, in Detroit. Linda had other possibilities, other paths. "That's a decision only you can make," I finally replied. "But whatever your choice, we'll be by your side, all of us." I looked at Jim, who nodded gravely. Even amid the anger he felt toward Richard, even amid the shock of the situation, his love for Linda spoke louder. He would be her safe harbor, just as he had been mine. "First," said Jim, his voice now more controlled, "we need to deal with Richard, with your grandfather." "He's dangerous," I warned. "You don't know what he's capable of." "I know," replied Linda in a low voice. "Now I know." The pain in her voice broke my heart. My daughter, whom I had tried to protect all her life, had been reached by the same evil that had affected me. History had repeated itself, despite all our efforts to rewrite the past. "I won't let him near you again," said Jim, iron determination in his voice. "Not you or the baby, if you decide to have it." "But how?" I asked, fear consuming me. "He always finds a way. Always." "This time it's different," replied Jim. We're no longer that young, scared couple fleeing in the middle of the night. We have an established life, we have resources, we have people who can help us." He stood up, took the phone, and began dialing a number. "I'm going to call Jason," he said, referring to our lawyer friend who occasionally helped us with garage matters. "We're going to get a restraining order against him and then go to the police." "Police?" I repeated, frightened. "But what proof do we have?" It was so long ago. "We have Linda's testimony," Jim replied firmly. "And if he did this to you and to her, he probably did it to other women too. The police can investigate, find other victims." The idea of publicly exposing our secret, of reliving all that horror in police stations and courts, terrified me. But looking at Linda, at the desperation in her eyes, I knew we had no choice. The cycle needed to be broken once and for all. The night stretched on in discussions, tears, planning. David, still trying to process everything he had heard, offered to sleep on the living room couch to stand guard, a naive but touching gesture of protection. My mother, devastated by the revelation that her lie hadn't protected us as she'd hoped, ended up taking a sedative and going to bed early. Linda decided to stay with us that night, unable to return to her own apartment where she had lived alone since she started working. "And Jason?" she asked at some point. "How am I going to tell him?" It was the most difficult question of all. How to explain something like this to the man she loved, who planned to marry her in a few months? How to ask him to accept a baby conceived under those circumstances? With the truth, I finally replied, "If he truly loves you, he'll understand. He'll support you just as Jim supported me." "And if he doesn't support me," she asked, fear evident in her voice. "Then he's not the man we thought he was," replied Jim simply, "and you deserve someone better." The next morning, exhausted but determined, we put our plan into action. Jason, the lawyer, came early to our house. He listened to the whole story with a professionalism I appreciated. No judgments, no excessive horror, just noting important details and asking pertinent questions. "We can easily get a restraining order," he said after hearing everything. "With Linda's and your testimonies, there's enough basis. As for the criminal process, it will be more complicated given the time that has passed. But not impossible, especially if, as we suspect, there are other victims." The plan was simple. Linda would arrange a meeting with Richard at the hotel where he was staying. She wouldn't go alone, of course. Jim and 2 police officers, friends of Jason, would be nearby, ready to intervene. At the right moment, we would confront Richard with the truth and with the police presence, serving him with the restraining order and informing him about the process we were initiating. "It's risky," warned Jason. "Men like him can react violently when they feel cornered." "That's why the police will be there," replied Jim. "We're not going to give him any chance to escape this time." Linda was nervous but determined. "I want to look him in the eyes," she said. "I want him to know that I discovered the truth, that I'm no longer an innocent victim he can manipulate." I reluctantly agreed to the plan. Part of me just wanted to run away again, take my family and disappear to some place where Richard would never find us. But another part, the one that had carried this weight for almost 3 decades, craved a confrontation, justice, a definitive end to this nightmare. Before leaving, Linda asked to speak to me alone. We went to the backyard, where the small jasmine I had planted years before perfumed the morning air. "Mom," she said, holding my hands, "before we confront him, I need to tell you something." "What is it, my daughter?" "I've decided to keep the baby," she said, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "I know it might seem crazy, but I remembered what you told me. about how you loved me from the first moment. Despite everything, I feel like I can do the same." I hugged my daughter tightly, feeling her body tremble against mine. How many times had I dreamed of this moment? Not the terrible revelation, but the deep understanding between us. How many times had I wondered if Linda would understand my choices, my secrets, my sacrifices? "Are you sure?" I asked, pulling away to look her in the eyes. "It's a very difficult decision, Linda, very personal." "I am," she replied, "and there's more. I talked to Jason last night after leaving here." My heart skipped a beat. "And how did he react?" A small smile, the first since this whole storm began, appeared on her face. "He cried with me, he was horrified, he was furious with my grandfather, but then he said something I'll never forget." "What did he say?" "That true love isn't just for the good times, it's mainly for the bad times, when we need it most, and that he loves me no matter what happens, that he'll love this baby as if it were his own, because it's mine, and everything that's mine he loves." Tears came to my eyes. How many times had Jim said similar words to me over the years? Words that sustained me, that gave me strength to go on. Linda had found her Jim, a good man strong enough to love beyond circumstances, to see beyond the shadows of the past. "He's a lucky man," I said, wiping away the tears. "Having you is the greatest blessing of his life, though he may not know it yet." Linda smiled again, a sad but determined smile. "He said the same about you and Dad. He said you're an example to him of how love can overcome anything." I hugged my daughter again, feeling a strange peace amid the chaos. Maybe that's what they call redemption, not erasing the past, but transforming it into something that, despite the pain, also brings growth, understanding, even a peculiar form of beauty. "We're ready," Jim called from the back door, interrupting our moment. Linda dried her tears, straightened her shoulders, and nodded. "We are," she replied, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "Let's end this once and for all." And so we set out for the confrontation that would define not only our future, but would finally liberate our past as well. The downtown hotel, where Richard was staying, was one of those rundown places that had seen better days, peeling paint on the walls, stained carpet in the lobby, an air of neglect that perfectly matched the man we had come to confront. We arrived in 2 cars, Jim, Linda, and I in one, Jason and the 2 plainclothes police officers in the other. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked Linda for the 1,000th time as we waited in the lobby. "We can still change our minds, do this another way." She squeezed my hand, her eyes fixed on the elevator door. "I'm sure, Mom. I need to look him in the eyes. I need him to know he no longer has power over any of us." Linda had called Richard earlier, arranging a meeting in the hotel restaurant. He didn't know we would all be there. He didn't know there would be police officers waiting in a discreet corner. He didn't know his life of abuse and manipulation was about to end. When the elevator opened and he stepped out, for a moment I didn't recognize him. The imposing man who terrorized my nightmares had transformed into a stooped old man, thinning white hair, deep wrinkles marking a face that no longer inspired fear, only contempt. He wore a cheap, wrinkled suit and walked with the help of a cane. His eyes, however, were the same, cold, calculating, scanning the environment like a predator. When he saw us, not just Linda, but all of us, he paused for an instant. I saw recognition in his gaze when he identified me, quickly followed by something that almost seemed like amusement. "Grace," he said, my name coming out like a harsh sigh from his lips. It's been a long time. I felt Jim tense beside me, his fists clenched. I put my hand on his arm, silently asking for calm. This was not the moment to lose control. Richard, I responded coldly, refusing to call him father. Looks like you found a way to come back from the dead. He gave a twisted smile, revealing yellowed teeth. Your mother always had a vivid imagination. Convenient for you to think I was dead. No, what wasn't convenient, Linda intervened, stepping forward, was for you to show up in my life, lie about who you were, and then her voice faltered for an instant, but she regained her composure, and then do what you did. Richard looked at Linda with an almost affectionate expression, which made my stomach turn with disgust. My granddaughter, or should I say, my daughter. You're so much like your mother at your age. I couldn't resist when I found you by chance at that hospital in Columbus. By chance? I asked, distrust clear in my voice. Or did you deliberately seek her out? He shrugged, leaning more heavily on his cane. What difference does it make? Fate brought us together. That's what matters. And now we have a new member of the family on the way. The naturalness with which he spoke of his crime, of his manipulations, left me breathless. It was as if, in his distorted mind, there was nothing wrong with what he had done, neither to me so many years ago, nor to Linda now. There will be no family reunion, said Jim, his voice controlled but filled with a contained rage he rarely showed. Richard sized him up with a look of contempt. Ah, good old Jim, always ready to raise other men's children, huh? First Linda, now this baby. A very understanding man. Before Jim could react to the provocation, Jason approached, the two police officers discreetly positioning themselves near the exits of the lobby. Mr. Richard Henderson, said Jason in a professional tone. My name is Jason Wright. I'm the family's lawyer. I have here a restraining order that prohibits you from approaching or contacting Linda Reynolds or any member of her family. He extended the document, which Richard completely ignored, his eyes still fixed on me. And also, continued Jason, unperturbed, I'm here to inform you that a formal complaint has been filed against you for the crimes of rape and sexual abuse. The police wish to take your statement. It was then that I saw, for the first time in my life, something I had never seen on my father's face. Fear. For a fleeting instant, the controls slipped, the mask fell, and he appeared as he really was, a frightened old man, trapped in his own crimes. But the moment passed quickly. He composed himself, the twisted smile returning to his lips. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice now carrying a poorly disguised irritation. Rape? Abuse? Linda came to me willingly. We had a consensual relationship. She's an adult, for God's sake. Under false pretenses, replied Linda, her voice surprisingly firm. You presented yourself as my grandfather, gained my trust, got me drunk, and only afterward told me who you really were. That's not consent. And it wasn't just her, I added, stepping forward. You did the same to me on the eve of my wedding, and probably to other women over the years. He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Prove something that supposedly happened almost 30 years ago. Be reasonable, Grace. No one is going to believe that far-fetched story. Maybe not, admitted Jason, if it were just Mrs. Reynolds' word against yours. But with Linda's testimony, plus the evidence we're gathering from other potential victims, the case becomes much more solid. The two police officers then approached, discreetly showing their badges. Mr. Henderson, said one of them, We'd like you to come with us to the station to make some clarifications. I saw panic growing in Richard's eyes. He looked around as if seeking an escape route, but the offices were already strategically positioned. Cornered, he did the only thing he still could: attack verbally. "You've always been ungrateful," he shot at me, his voice loaded with venom. "I gave you and your mother a roof, food on the table, and this is how you thank me, hounding me with lies, destroying my reputation." I didn't respond. There was nothing more to say to this man who had destroyed so many lives, including mine and my daughter's. Instead, I took a step forward and did something I never imagined I would have the courage to do. I looked him directly in the eyes and smiled, a calm smile, without anger, without fear, the smile of someone who has finally been free. "It's over, Richard," I said simply. "Your time is up." He was taken away by the police without physical resistance. He was too old for that, but cursing and threatening the whole time. He promised to sue us all. He swore he had powerful friends. He assured us he would be out of the police station in a few hours, but there was a desperation in his threats that revealed his truth. He knew that this time he would not escape. When the police car drove away, I felt an enormous weight being lifted from my shoulders, a weight I had carried for almost 30 years, since that terrible night that changed my life forever. I looked at Linda, who was crying silently beside Jim, and I knew she felt the same. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice small like the child she once was. "Not completely," replied Jason honestly. "There will be statements, possibly a trial. It will be a long and sometimes painful process. But the worst is over. He can't hurt you anymore." We returned home in silence, each absorbed in our own thoughts. David and my mother were anxiously waiting, and when we told them what had happened, there was a mixture of relief and apprehension. The road ahead would still be difficult, but at least now we could see it clearly. That night, Linda finally called Jason and asked him to come to our house. It was time to face the next challenge, telling the man she loved the whole truth about her pregnancy, about the origin of the baby she was expecting. Jason arrived an hour later. He was a tall young man, with glasses, quiet in his manner, who always reminded me a bit of Jim when he was young. Even without knowing all the details, he already knew something serious had happened. Linda had briefly told him on the phone that she had discovered something disturbing about her family, and that she needed to tell him the complete story. The living room fell silent as Linda and I, alternating, told the whole story. From the rape I suffered decades ago to the recent events with Richard. Jason listened to everything without interrupting, his face growing paler, his hands occasionally closing into fists when the most painful details were revealed. When we finished, the silence extended for several minutes. Jason looked at Linda as if seeing her for the first time, not with contempt or disgust as she feared, but with a mixture of horror at what had happened and a deep admiration for her courage. He began, his voice failing. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. I can't even imagine." Linda took his hands, her eyes pleading. "I understand if you want to cancel the wedding. I understand if you don't want to raise this baby knowing where it comes from. I just ask that." Jason interrupted her by gently placing a finger on her lips. "Don't say that. Never say that. I love you, Linda. I love everything about you, your strength, your kindness, your heart. What happened wasn't your fault, and it certainly isn't this baby's fault." He turned to Jim and me, his eyes now determined behind his glasses. "You have shown me what true love means, standing by those we love no matter what happens. I want to do the same for Linda and for this baby. I want to be the father this child deserves, just as Jim was for Linda." Jim, who rarely showed emotion in public, couldn't hold back his tears. He stood up and embraced Jason tightly, an embrace that said more than any words. The months that followed were intense. Richard was formally charged not only for the crimes against Linda, but also against 2 other women who had the courage to come forward after the case gained some local publicity. Due to his age and a convenient diagnosis of heart problems, he won the right to respond to the process while free, but with an electronic ankle monitor and prohibition from leaving the city or approaching any of the victims. Linda and Jason's wedding was postponed until after the baby was born, their decision so that the child would already be a part of the ceremony in some way. Linda's belly grew and, with it, strangely, a new sense of peace in our family. It was as if by bringing to light the dark secrets that had tormented us for so many years, we had finally opened space for genuine happiness to flourish. Jason proved incredible throughout the pregnancy. He accompanied Linda to all consultations. He read books on parenting. He even began preparing the baby's room much earlier than necessary. When they discovered it would be a girl, it was he who suggested the name Olivia. "Because she will bring light to our lives," he explained, his hand affectionately on Linda's belly. "She will be the beginning of a new story without the shadows of the past." My mother, who had initially been devastated by the whole situation, gradually found peace as well. We never spoke directly about the lie she had maintained for so many years about Richard's death, but I knew she had done what she thought best to protect us. Forgiveness came naturally. It didn't need to be asked for or formally granted. Olivia was born on a sunny May morning in 1992, a difficult birth like Linda's had been. But in the end, when they placed that small bundle in my daughter's arms, I saw on her face the same thing I had felt when I held Linda for the first time, a love so great, so pure, that it completely transcended the dark circumstances of conception. Jason, beside her on the hospital bed, looked at mother and daughter with such love it was almost palpable. Jim, holding my hand as we observed the scene, whispered, "It's like a cycle coming full circle, isn't it?" Linda found her Jim, just as you found yours. I nodded, unable to speak through the tears. That was exactly it, a cycle closing, a wound finally healing, a new generation beginning without the crushing weight of the secrets we had carried for so long. Richard's trial began 3 months after Olivia's birth. It was a difficult, painful process with moments when both Linda and I almost gave up. Reliving those traumas, being questioned by defense attorneys who tried to make us look like liars or confused. Facing the cold gaze of the man who had destroyed so many lives was almost unbearable, but we supported each other. Our entire family united as never before. Jim, David, Jason, my mother, even the other victims who had come forward. We formed a united front against the evil that man represented, and we won. In January 1993, Richard was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Given his advanced age, 75 at the time, it was practically a life sentence. He would not leave prison alive. When the judge announced the sentence, I didn't feel the euphoria I had expected. There were no shouts of joy or exultant embraces, just a deep collective sigh, as if our entire family could finally release the breath we had been holding for decades. "Is it the end?" asked Linda, holding Olivia in her arms as we left the courthouse. "It's a new beginning," I replied, gently touching my granddaughter's face, "for all of us." Linda and Jason's wedding took place 2 months later, with Olivia, now almost a year old, being carried down the aisle as a little flower girl in David's arms. It was a simple but moving ceremony, full of tears of joy and promises of a better future. During the reception, I observed my family gathered together. Jim, now with gray hair but the same kind cook as always, David, a grown man with his girlfriend by his side, Linda and Jason, radiant in their newly official happiness, Olivia smiling and clapping on my mother's lap, unaware that her very existence represented the triumph of love over hate, of light over darkness. In that moment, I knew it had been worth it. All the horrors, all the flights, all the painful secrets, everything had brought us to this point, to this moment of genuine peace and joy. It wasn't a fairy tale happy ending. We would always carry the scars of what we had lived through, but it was an honest ending, a true one, conquered with sweat and tears and a fierce determination not to let evil have the last word. The years went by. Linda and Jason had 2 more children, Michael and Sophie, who grew up with Olivia as the big sister they adored and respected. We never hid the truth about Olivia's birth, but we told it in an age-appropriate way, always emphasizing the love that surrounded her, the family that chose to love her, regardless of how she had come into the world. Jim retired from the garage, which David took over and expanded. I closed the restaurant when I turned 70, but I still bake my apple pies for the family on weekends, a tradition that keeps alive a bit of that girl from rural Ohio I once was. My mother passed away peacefully at 92, surrounded by great-grandchildren who adored her and by a daughter and granddaughter who had completely forgiven her. Richard died in prison in 1998, alone and forgotten. When I received the news, I felt neither joy nor sadness, just a strange relief, like someone who can finally close a book whose dark story no longer has power to frighten. Today, at 78 years old, sitting here at this pie stand that my grandchildren insisted on setting up so I could tell my stories, I look back and see a path full of thorns, but also of flowers that bloomed against all odds. I see a frightened girl who became a strong woman, a hopeless young woman who found true love, a desperate mother who managed to protect her daughter, even when the past threatened to repeat its worst chapter. Olivia is 33 now. She's a pediatric doctor, married with a small child of her own. She grew up knowing the whole truth about her birth, but that never defined her, never limited her. On the contrary, it gave her a special compassion for the vulnerable, a sensitivity to others' suffering that makes her an exceptional doctor. The evil that Richard tried to spread ended up generating, against his will, more goodness in the world. And isn't that how we win in the end? Not just by surviving, but by transforming our pain into something beautiful, something that helps others, something that leaves the world a little better than how we found it. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's not easy to listen to stories like this, just as it's not easy to tell them. I believe that sharing our wounds, our struggles, and our victories is a way of extending a hand to someone who might be going through something similar, of saying, "You're not alone. There is a path ahead. There is light after darkness." Remember always, your past may explain why you are the way you are, but it doesn't determine who you can become. The last page of your story hasn't been written yet, and the pen is in your hand.